For those of you who are just joining, as Megan said, we're doing 2 presentations today. So I'm going to do mine, which is kind of a big picture thing, and then Juliet is going to talk about a specific program to gain funding for conservation work. So our frameworks are a little bit different, but I'm talking about watershed health. She's talking about conservation. It could be potato, but it might be different. So I'm talking about sustainable funding for watershed health, and I was challenged when doing this for the Rural Policy Learning Commons, which I'm a fellow with that program as well as a senior manager with the Columbia Basin Watershed Network. I was challenged to think more about how nonprofit funding relates to policy, and I think that for me, the main idea here is that we need to think about policy more in terms of more as a governance function, I think, than classic what the government decides how they decide to set priority and do regulations and set their priorities. We need to think about policy in the larger governance framework. So to me, the policy actors in the watershed stewardship include government, industry, and the government industry partnerships, as well as nonprofits and the various partnerships. So my main idea is that watershed stewardship, protecting all the values of water, requires this kind of networked and partnered effort in decision-making and funding, and that's really what I'm talking about. So watershed stewardship requires significant investment in what I'm going to talk about, a public or common good. Given the regulatory failures of the last 2 decades in Canada and British Columbia at the federal and provincial level, and the increasing conflicts and pressures on watersheds, we need innovative things. We need to do some innovative things and bring new partnerships and new collaborations, and we need to figure out how to do that. So, and I think in some cases that means making partners where we maybe didn't see partners before. So we need to, I'm talking about watershed stewardship and protection agendas, combining those with classic environmental kinds of values and inherent value, those kinds of values, with some of the more utility or utilitarian values like infrastructure and municipal assets. So, and of course, quality of life. We need to bring partnerships together so that people can pursue these in the watershed stewardship agenda. So that's the only way I see that we can support the kind of investment and effort required to secure healthy and sufficient water for all purposes. So that is a very long introduction. However, I really feel like that's the main idea of my talks. If you want to go grab a coffee, the rest of it's all the details. So I'm going to go through this. The public good concept, which those of you who are policy wonks would be familiar with. Environmental protection, the importance of the nonprofit sector in representing the non-cash values. I'm going to sort of skate by what I call the informal regulatory structures. And then just look at where are the potential for nonprofit groups to be establishing new values, to network in a networked way, push this policy agenda forward. From economics, you have a private good, which is the things that we all own, and a common good, which is the things that are limited numbers of us share in a kind of a controlled way, like a community garden or a park. And then we have a public good, which is more like air, water. Although water's a complicated example, it's hard to find perfect examples of any economic concept. But anyway, we typically think of watersheds as a public good, and what that means is that if you put money into the watershed, you don't necessarily own it or get any benefit from it. And so I've sort of gone through a little who pays for what currently in British Columbia. So the province has actually been reducing their investment in regulation and monitoring. And what cash benefit they get from watershed stewardship. They get some indirect benefits from resource development, but they don't get any they don't see how they're benefiting from watershed stewardship. I'll put it that way. Whereas local governments, I'm just going to jump down here, local governments see a high benefit from watershed stewardship because of things like public safety and water quality. And, it's important for local governments because it increases property taxes. And local governments have been increasing in a limited way some of their investments in watershed stewardship. But the other actors, like the resource sector, has a regulatory requirement to do some kinds of things. So for them, it's a high cost, and they don't capture much value in a private way. So there's a lot of misfits between who is paying and who is benefiting, which is what you often see with public and common goods. So, and of course, I'm thinking in the Kootenays, in a downstream resident from a watershed, we have a watershed up in the mountains, and then we have a resident at the bottom. Often, I have no effective way of investing in the quality of my watershed, so I have very little cost. But then, and the value that I see from that, well, if I drink that water, it's very high. If I am not, if a landslide doesn't come down on me, then that's very high value. But it's quite dependent on my specific location. The way that we invest in watershed stewardship as a government, as a policy, is that we invest in some regulations. Water is regulated as a resource. As a pollution sink, there's limits in environmental regulation about how much effluent you can put into streams. And in some of our legislation, where we start to see fish protection and water quality protection, but in British Columbia, a lot of those aren't yet fully implemented. So most of the classic regulatory protections, the federal protected waters, the federal fisheries enforcement, and some of the provincial requirements have been reduced or abandoned and not yet restored. So overall, over the last 2 decades, direct public investments in water regulation and protection have been reduced. So then, public good, are we getting enough watershed stewardship? And I guess I kind of talked about this in the earlier slide, is that basically we have socially underinvestment in watershed stewardship. Those that are required to pay aren't really seeing the benefit, and somehow as a public agenda item, it's kind of not as visible as it could be. And those of us who are watershed beneficiaries lack the means to choose to protect watersheds, either through a market or through our policy, through our traditional policy mechanisms. And I mean, there's people that are working on that to try to organize more effective political constituency for water. But overall, we see indicators of watershed health going down over time as fish health and abundance and nutrient pollution levels. And as we actually start, we're still really seeing some of the impacts of hydroelectric development. I mean, it takes a while for those predictable declines in biodiversity to take effect. So those are still happening. So what we have here, where watershed stewardship policy, what's the role for policy of nonprofits? Well, what we have, when you look at the policy environment, how has this happened? Like, how have we lost all these regulations? Well, we have, there's strong partnerships between the public and the resource development sectors. There's well-organized and well-funded groups that lobby for reduced, lower costs, so what they have to pay to protect watershed stewardship, and lower regulatory standards. And so where the nonprofit sector really, from the structural point of view, needs to come in is to form those partnerships to explicitly claim the value for protecting the watershed stewardship, protecting the waters, and advocating for public support And practically, nonprofits offer a lower cost stewardship alternative. It sounds like something I'm advertising, but practically, nonprofits can do things at lower cost than maybe in the 70s we might have thought that the government was going to do. But fundamentally, watershed nonprofits can create a choice through which the rest of us can invest in watersheds. So that's what finally gets us to watershed funding, through which is by donations, by grants. So now we're going to look at very quickly, how do nonprofit groups develop and maintain that funding? Well, they're grant funded. Nonprofits primarily grant funded, also some donations. So we have to look at how the granting process, really the granting process from a governance point of view, is how nonprofits interact with those same other policy organizations. And so right now, it's very hard to get significant sums for nonprofits. Projects are typically funded for no more than 1 year of duration. And there's fairly high demand, high levels of competition. You have to look at what are the motivations of grantors. And groups increasingly need more than one grant at a time. Sustainable funding would support the goals of watershed stewardship over a time frame that would allow you to actually achieve some of those goals. So I like Todd Reeve of the Bonneville Community Foundation has said 10-year minimum investment, and at a level that's adequate to ensure the continued quality, quantity, and flow and health of watersheds, and that would reflect the value and contributions of watersheds to human health and safety and property value in the environment. So we're looking at some huge values. Classically, we've done a lot of donations for conservation, which is where people are able to just send money, which works very well for culturally appealing kinds of places, but doesn't always protect the garden variety watersheds that we might be relying on for drinking water or flood protection. So I want to spend about a minute on this, and then I'll come around to a conclusion. When we're seeking partnerships, our partnerships are going to be based on value. So the nonprofit groups are currently classically organized around protection values and around aesthetic and spiritual values. Some of the Watershed Network member groups are also organized around water quality and quality of aquatic health, so a more scientific criteria. So when you start to look at those values in the left-hand column, you look at where could those classic nonprofits be making better partnerships with other constituencies who are going to value watershed protection also from a different perspective. And so the more of those partnerships you get with those other groups that are in the public sphere, and the more you're able to link watershed protection to the things that they value. So safety from flood and fire, I think, is very important to citizens. But the more that you can combine those values and bring constituencies together, the more you can open up other funding channels. So get over to the right-hand column, in becoming less dependent on a particular set of grants and opening up funding, local government funding, and eventually some other kinds of policy priority through making those partnerships and through organizing the kind of relationships that have classically, that have always been between resource groups and governance folks. So how does this look on the ground? Well, like any good idea, a lot of people are already trying it. So right now, there's several United States examples, but there's examples where utilities like city water utilities are some have bought their entire watersheds, and I guess Vancouver has control of their entire watersheds, but but some utilities are paying for forestry and grazing best practices in upstream watersheds to lower their treatment costs. And there's a regulatory control way of doing that in the US, but there's also just a best practices way, a voluntary way of doing that. Local governments are starting to compare the costs, with some encouragement, are starting to compare the costs of investing in green infrastructure like wetlands compared to investing in the concrete kinds of infrastructure that they've already done. And so you have green infrastructure projects, eco-asset projects, and those kinds of things allow nonprofit groups with an interest in watershed protection to partner with local governments. It opens up basically utility funding, both of those, to the practices of watershed stewardship. We have payments for ecosystem services. We have a lot of different avenues that are based on these partnerships, but you have to be able to, actually form those partnerships. Now, I just wanted to skip through again these specific examples and say, where is this going? Well, we look for practical examples in watershed partnering, particularly working with local governments as partners and contractors and values engagement. Grantor to nonprofit relationship building is an important one to sort of reduce the levels of suspicion and figure out how nonprofits can meet the needs of grantor organizations better. So we need to create those high quality, high trust, low cost opportunities to bring more dollars, and we have to base them on shared interests. That's where I'm going with this project. I wanted to conclude. I'm just aware that I'm right at time. And I really like the idea of explicitly thinking about how the nonprofit world relates to the policy world. And with that, I think I would like to pass this over to Juliet.
And we do have about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has any, you can write them in the Q&A box, and I'll read them out and Tara will answer them.
This is on its way to being a paper, and that's why I keep trying to skip past the I keep having to skip past the green infrastructure section of it.
And we have a question in the chat box. If you can give a couple examples of private corporations that support nonprofits via funding for water offsets.
Yes, and so, and actually, Thea, you can access a webinar from Todd Reeve on the Watershed Network website. Actually, I suppose anyone can. But so yes, there's some good examples of that, and I would direct you to Todd Reeves' work with the Bonneville Foundation. So, but we have in our area, in rural areas, some of the same problems with that kind of funding as with grant funding. So he says it's best when there's a good, strong relationship between the corporation and the watershed you're trying to protect. So it's very difficult to get a distant corporation to make a long-term commitment to the watershed because it's not serving their interest. But what they're trying to do is so that they've created a marketplace where nonprofits can, post their opportunity for funding on their website, and corporations that are participating in the program can pick projects to fund. So I can tell you more about that.
Okay. And we have another question from Yasmin Keeler. Can you provide an example where a tax or toll is being used to generate funds? What is typically the cost to the ratepayer?
I'm going to say, excellent question, Yasmin. We're going to have that example in a minute from Juliet. I think a fantastic example.
Good. Well, if there are no other questions, that could be a good lead into Juliet's presentation.
Thank you. I could have paid you to ask that question. That was the perfect segue. Thank you. So what I am going to be talking about is just that, an example of a tax-based revenue that supports conservation. So it's the Local Conservation Fund, and it's a unique partnership in Canadian conservation. And when we talk about the Kootenays in BC, I think most of you aren't from BC, but we're talking about the very southeast corner that butts against Alberta, Montana, Idaho, and Washington. So that's what we mean by the Kootenays. So I'll be talking about what is a local conservation fund and why and how was it established, how does it work and what's been accomplished from it. And the hope is that it can be used as a model for other areas, and it certainly has been over the years. So it is, as I mentioned, a tax-based revenue where voters actually agree to increase their tax rate specifically to go into a pot for conservation purposes. So it's not general revenue taxes, it's specifically for conservation. And just to give a bit of background on how it started and why, it started in the East Kootenay, and it's particularly in the Columbia Valley area. It's a beautiful area that butts against the Rocky Mountains. It's a place where people really value quality of life. There's open ranches and farms, clean water and air, abundant fish and wildlife, recreational and outdoor opportunities, and a really beautiful area. So people from all walks of life really value those features of living there. And specifically, private land is very important in this context. In the Kootenays, only 6.7% of the land base is actually private land, but that valley bottom habitat, which is where most of the private land is very important for things like dry forests, grasslands, riparian ecosystems, rivers, waterways, wetlands. So there's a disproportionate amount of conservation value on a relatively small part of the land base. So for example, in this 6.7%, although that's the private land, it contains about a quarter of two of our dry forest types on the land base, which often have ecosystems and species at risk. And these valley bottoms are also important corridors between large tracts of crown land on either side, the federal parks or provincial parks or just crown forestry land for large mammals such as grizzly bears and wolverines, and then a suite of species below them that travel between one large tract of land to another through these small valley bottoms of private land. So this is a map actually of the Creston Valley, and it's based on the research of Dr. Michael Proctor, who did a lot of genetics and radiotelemetry work for grizzly bear movement, and it's provided by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, who looked at this to say this is really where we need to be ensuring wildlife corridors in this region. In terms of species at risk, these private lands are extremely important as well. The Provincial Ministry of Environment did a mapping analysis looking at where the occurrences of species at risk are, and found that in the central or west Kootenay area, it's over 70% of species at risk occurrences are on private land, and in the East Kootenay, that's almost 90%. So very important to species like badgers and Lewis's woodpecker and other both federally or provincially listed species. So there was a group of people from a variety of backgrounds who got together in 2002, and we're seeing development in these valley bottoms, and we're concerned about their quality of life, concerned about impacts to water, subdividing these large ranches, impacts to wildlife corridors through development, and those sorts of things. So they formed the East Kootenay Conservation Program, which is a multi-stakeholder partnership with the mandate to coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land, and primarily to generate the support and resources for that. So knowing that the variety of partners each had a role to play in private land conservation from their specific background and mandate, but that they could do more by working together. So that was in 2002, and then in 2012, the program expanded to the West Kootenay area and became from the East Kootenay Conservation Program to the Kootenay Conservation Program. So they looked at how do we better support conservation on private land? We collectively know it's important. We think that if the land trusts could buy more lands for conservation lands, that would be important, as well as private landowners stewarding these resources well. And one of the bottom line issues, which I'm sure all of you on this webinar agree with, is finding money for that, finding funding. And so they had this idea that had been tried in the United States but never done in Canada, to actually ask taxpayers if they would tax themselves for conservation. So that's the reasons why it was established. How it was established was through a 5-step process. And this is what's recommended if it's going to be used as a model in other areas. And the first is feasibility research. Is it realistic for the area you're looking at, or acceptable? Are there a broad range of partners from multiple perspectives and backgrounds that are committed to this approach? And is it possible? And then doing some follow-up research on that through telephone polling and focus groups. So the polling indicates which parts of the area is this type of tax generated revenue for conservation likely to be palatable. And then the qualitative research, the focus groups, indicate what are people willing to pay for, what values, and how much are they willing to pay. And the next is to build coalitions. And this is a picture of Dave Hillary. He was the program manager of the Kootenay Conservation Program before me and was actively involved in establishing these local conservation funds. So building a strong coalition of partners, identifying what the purpose is and who the allies and the opponents are, who's missing from the table, who needs to be involved. And then identifying if there is public support. And this is important in BC, and I think it was you, I was talking to Paul, that said this wouldn't happen in Ontario, for example, but in BC there has to be proof that there's public support or strong evidence, and that can be done either through a referendum or the alternative approval process. And so that's where it's really important to have strong working partnerships with local government and their staff to determine the best approach of these options. And then finally, if it's going to referendum, a strong campaign around voting, what people would be voting for, why they would do this, and getting the word out there. So that's what happened in this Columbia Valley subregion of the Regional District of East Kootenay. And so the issue went to referendum on 2008, and it passed. So local taxpayers agreed to tax themselves $20 per parcel per year, and that generates $230,000 a year approximately. And it's in this subregion of the East Kootenay, which includes 2 electoral areas of the Regional District of East Kootenay, as well as the municipalities of Invermere, Radium, Hot Springs, and Canal Flats. So the important thing about the local conservation fund, or one of them, is what people are paying for. The idea is that this is tailored to local values and the importance of those values. So protecting the quality of life in this area through conservation and restoration of fish and wildlife habitat, conservation of watersheds, and conservation of open space, including farmland and these large ranches. So this model was then used in 2014 in the West Kootenay. So when the Kootenay Conservation Program expanded to include the West Kootenay, or the Regional District of Central Kootenay, the same approach was used, and polling and research was done. A subregion of the area was identified as this would likely pass, and it went to referendum in 2014, and it did pass, and that was the Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Fund. Based on the focus groups, the residents there were more likely to pay $15 per parcel per year. So it is a parcel tax, so large properties may be made up of several parcels. And this generates about $130,000 available every year. And then the model was also used in the South Okanagan, in the southern central portion of BC, and went through the alternative approval process in December 2016 and just passed. So they're establishing their South Okanagan Local Conservation Fund. The model's been seen as an amazing, innovative, and collaborative approach. And the directors of the RDEK and the municipalities in that area, as well as the residents, are seen as innovative leaders to take this on. So for it to be established, they established a bylaw as required by the Local Government Act. And the bylaw actually had a 10-year sunset clause because they weren't sure exactly how it would function, if they'd have enough applications, how projects would be decided upon, how it would all work basically. But they agreed and voted, the RDEK directors voted last year to actually remove that sunset clause. So now this is a long-term service established in the RDEK. So how does it function? Well, the Kootenay Conservation Program still plays a strong role and has a strong partnership with the local government. And we take on a lot of the burden of the administration and advertising and the other staff time issues that would fall upon the local government. It's still a local government fund, and the directors make the decision on which projects get funded, and the contribution agreement is between the local government and the proponent. But the KCP plays a role by putting out the request for proposals, doing the advertising around this and the media around requesting proposals. We strike technical review committees that have biologists and others with strong technical background who can review and rank the proposals on behalf of the local government. We also do media around what's being funded, why it's important, and take the directors as well as the technical review committee out on field tours to see the projects on the ground and see their taxpayers' dollars at work. So what's been accomplished in these last 9 years or so? In the Columbia Valley, it's had a 9-year granting history and 60 projects have been funded. That's over $1.6 million that's been contributed to conservation projects in that area, which is significant. In the Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Fund, it was voted on in 2014 and established really in 2015. So it's had the projects delivered or supported in 2016 and 17. So some of the projects that are being funded are acquisition of land. So that's the Nature Conservancy of Canada and the Nature Trust of BC, who actually buy properties for conservation purposes or place covenants on properties. So they can't be subdivided or they can't be fenced to reduce, to prevent wildlife corridors, but they can still, in some cases, be farmed or ranched. They also, both them and other organizations, use some funds for ecosystem restoration. So in our dry forests and grasslands, that's forest canopy opening and fire maintenance for those areas, as well as habitat restoration, such as stream and creek restoration for fish habitat. In this example, the Rod and Gun Club removed barriers and kokanee salmon returned to a stream that they hadn't been in for decades. Wetland stewardship is funded, so this is an example of a boardwalk through a sensitive wetland and some panels describing the importance of this area for ecosystem health in the area. There's been a variety of projects on species at risk, including the rare and endangered northern leopard frog being reintroduced, working with landowners who have bats in their buildings and promoting bat conservation, grizzly bear work, promoting electric fencing to reduce conflicts between people and grizzly bears, western toad research to help reduce mortality on highways, and osprey monitoring to determine areas for potential nest box or nest platform placement. This Ecological Goods and Services project was funded. It's now being rebranded as Farmland Advantage, but it really did start in the Columbia Valley, paying farmers for the service of having clean water and healthy wetlands, healthy grasslands. So actually developing contracts with agriculturalists that they get paid for these services. Invasive plant management of high priority species and the Neighborhood Invasive Plant Program, helping a cost share program with landowners who are treating invasive plants on their property. And water quality monitoring. And I know a couple of you on the webinar are from the Columbia Lake Stewardship Society and Lake Windermere Ambassadors. There's also been the Friends of Kootenay Lake, a variety of groups that have received funding for water quality and quantity monitoring and trying to link that to local government policy and planning around water. As one director, Director Wilkie, said, each project on its own is small, but there's a cumulative effect that has a large impact on conservation in this region. And the local government benefits in a number of ways. In their official community plans in this area, things like wildlife and habitat values, agricultural values, reducing invasive plants, retaining wildlife corridors, those are written into these official community plans. So these funds and projects directly help support those goals of the local government. There's also an economic benefit. So in the Columbia Valley, there's been 1.6 million generated in tax revenue between 2008 and 2016. But when I went through the proposals of what funds were leveraged, so what is being brought in as partner funding on those projects, that's an additional 10 to 60 million brought into this tiny area, I shouldn't say tiny, but a relatively small region of the East Kootenay, which has significant economic benefits. And it also allows local organizations to demonstrate local support for their project and have a first in small funds that they can then leverage these other dollars with. And these dollars don't just go to these organizations and natural resource professionals, but to many other professionals like graphic designers or sign printers or herbicide applicators, excavator drivers, as well as buying the materials and supplies for the projects, culverts, fencing, boat rentals, fuel, that sort of thing. So we're looking at opportunities for expanding the local conservation fund. And again, polling and market research is very important to know exactly where this would be palatable. It's certainly easier now that there's a model out there. There's an example terms of reference. There's an example scoring of projects. There's lots of examples that have now been developed from this beginning fund. There's actually a guidebook being rewritten as we speak. It should be ready in the next few weeks, exactly about establishing a local conservation fund. So this is the older version, which is currently available on the South Okanagan-Similkameen Conservation Program's website. It's being updated to be inclusive of the Kootenays and other areas of BC, and it will be available on our website when it's available. We'll have a link to that. And I encourage you, if you have any questions, you can ask me now or feel free to email me through the kootenayconservation.ca website. We also have a web page on the local conservation funds. I'm just curious how I'm doing for time, because I have a small 3-minute video I could show if we have time.
Yeah, there's still about 5 minutes.
About 5 minutes? Well, I'll show you this video because it was put together. It's really lovely, and hopefully the sound works for you. Let me know if it doesn't. Whoops.
In late 2008, voters in the Regional District of East Kootenay's electoral areas F and G and the municipalities of Invermere, Radium Hot Springs, and Canal Flats elected to establish the Columbia Valley Local Conservation Fund. Property owners in participating areas agreed to pay about $20 per parcel per year into a dedicated fund for conservation projects in the Columbia Valley. Since the fund's launch, over $1 million has been awarded to projects that are helping conserve water, wildlife habitat, and significant open spaces. The largest award to date went to purchase District Lot 48, over 50 hectares critical to wildlife, native grasslands, wetlands, and the Chinook Nation. It's the last remaining piece in the Upper Columbia Valley's 7,500-hectare conservation puzzle. While the Conservation Fund is a great asset, its leveraging power is even greater. In the case of District Lot 48, industry and community partners, governments and individuals saw the Conservation Fund's commitment as proof of local support. They then came on board with additional money required to purchase the property. Conserving this property helped resolve a long-standing land use issue for a range of groups that wanted to preserve the area's natural and cultural values. The Kootenay Conservation Program, a partnership of 54 conservation organizations, industry, and government agencies, helps run the fund. They select experts for the Technical Review Committee, which makes funding recommendations to the regional districts. This conservation fund was made possible through the dedicated work of various organizations, the Regional District of East Kootenay, and Kootenay Conservation Program staff, along with strong public support. The very existence of the fund demonstrates East Kootenay residents' commitment to conserving natural areas in their region and stands as a model for others in BC.
Okay, that was a very good presentation. We now have about 15 minutes open for questions, and I have 2 written down already. Question from Denise was, what is an alternative approval process example?
That's how the South Okanagan Local Conservation Fund was passed. And it was primarily done that route because it wasn't in line with an election. So referendums are very expensive when they're not being done with an existing election, which is due to happen in 2018, and that fund was established in 2016. So it's a process that the local government can use where they state what their intention is, that they will be establishing this fund at this percent property tax, which is what it's based on there. And if they get complaints over, I think it's 10% of the voting population writes in to complain, then it won't pass, and it would then have to go to a referendum. But if they get less than 10% of opposition, then that can be considered a voter approval, and they can pass it that way. So I think that they have to leave, and I'm certainly not an expert on this, but it's either 45 or 60 days that it has to be open for these responses.
Okay. Our next question, Yasmin Keeler asked was, when you say parcel, how large is the area? A quarter section or larger?
Oh, again, I'm not sure what a quarter section is, but I don't actually know. I just know that some of these large ranches can be made up of, 10 parcels. So that's a significant amount of money to a property owner. And in one village of Caslow, which is on Kootenay Lake, they didn't participate in the Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Fund because it's an old mining town where the parcels were actually very tiny that just supported one little miner's house. So a lot in that village is typically 4 to 6 parcels. So a parcel tax in that sense would have been quite expensive for that municipality. So they didn't opt in to this fund. I'm sorry, I don't have more specifics on the details of property sizes. Do you, Tara?
Well, I was just going to say a quarter section is 160 acres.
Okay.
So I guess the difference is just a parcel is any unit of land that is a taxed unit of land that has a description. So it has no specific dimension. So they go from the 25 foot by 100 foot in Caslow to, I'm not sure actually how agricultural land is platted, meaning how big the parcels are.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Okay. So our next question was from Anna Friedis. Was there also a significant portion of the Kootenay community that opposed the conservation fund tax? If so, what were some reasons for that, and how were those concerns addressed?
So that's what the telephone polling indicated. It indicated where there were regions where the fund would likely not pass. So in these cases, the referendums were close. I think it passed, I believe it was 53% or something, which is quite typical in a referendum. There was some concerns around paying the difference between conservation and protection. So people wanted to ensure that this didn't mean protection of all lands, that they couldn't hunt and fish and have recreational opportunities. And it wasn't just supporting one environmentalist sector of the community. And that's why it's important to have a broad range of perspectives. So ranchers, farmers, environmental groups, nonprofits, business owners, all sorts of people at the table. There's also concerns about how the money is distributed. In our 2 cases, the money goes into a general pot, and then the applications and projects are distributed based on technical merit. But my understanding is in the South Okanagan, there was some discussion around if a municipality is paying, say, 15% of that pot, they should have 15% of the project benefits. So that's sometimes a concern. In the beginning, there was concerns about how the money would be allocated. Would this just be pet projects, or how would they be reviewed? But I think that the example of the Technical Review Committee, it's arm's length and it's a strong committee. As the program manager for Kootenay Conservation Program, I don't rank projects or decide on projects, and that the ultimate decision-making power is still at the regional district level. So those are some of the questions that may come up.
Well, and I think that the Kootenays, southeastern British Columbia, the East Kootenay is probably politically more conservative than the rest of British Columbia. So there's also just a plain old anti-tax, anti-government sentiment that is going to be present, I think, no matter what initiative you're talking about.
That's a really good point, because there's an area in our region that has strong environmental value to conservation, but strong opposition to government involvement, taxes, and regulation. So although the projects, there's a lot of organizations that could benefit, a lot of conservation value in that region, it's unlikely that taxpayers would vote to increase their taxes. Also acknowledge, I see your note, Paul, about the A-list program, so I'll definitely look into that, and I have your email address. So thank you for reminding me about that.
Okay. Okay, so I would like to thank our presenters, Juliet and Tara, for their wonderful presentations, as well as our audience who had some great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.